All right, so welcome. Today's Intentional Aging program is a discussion of nutrition with two graduate students from the University of Washington, Danny Beery and Victoria Jansen. And when I hand things over to them, they'll give you a little introduction, tell you a little bit about themselves. Before we get started, I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement. And that is the North Olympic Library System acknowledges that the lands on which we live and gather are the appropriated homelands of Indigenous peoples. We want to express our deepest respect to those peoples past and present, including the Hoh tribe, Jamestown S'Klallam tribe, Lower Elwha Klallam tribe, Makah Indian tribe, Quileute tribe, Quinault Indian Nation, Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe, and the Skokomish tribe for their care of these lands throughout the generations. Let us learn more about the histories, cultures, and traditions of Indigenous peoples. Let us strengthen relationships with sovereign tribal nations to provide an inclusive space, fostering innovation and collaboration at the library. So again, thank you to everybody who's attending. For those of you that are brand new to the program, your registration for today's program is a single standalone reservation. To do the whole series, you will want to register for the March 15th date we have coming up in 2 weeks. All of the other programs are linked. This was an extra session that we added and I couldn't add it to the existing setup. If you have any questions on that, just drop me an email, reply to any of those that I've sent, and I can help make sure that you're getting the reminder notifications for those future programs as well. And on that note, in 2 weeks, we've got Katie Bowman coming, talking about her dynamic aging book and the importance of movement. And it's not up on the website yet, but I do have in April, Jennifer Kulik, who is the founder of an organization called Silver Kite Intergenerational Arts. And her presentation is going to be on the importance of play throughout our life. And then in May, I'm going to try something new. I have a fun, I didn't bring it over here, a fun fiction book that I wanted to share with you guys, and I'll drop that title a little bit later. I'll grab a copy before we're done today. So what I'd like to do though is get things going with Victoria and Danny. So I'm going to go ahead and hand that over. They are going to be screen sharing. They've got some slides. So if you're having any trouble viewing those, please let us know in the chat. And of course, you can drop any questions or issues you're having in the chat and use the hand raise piece. And if you have any questions throughout the program, the presentation, to ask them. All right, any questions before we get started? Are we good? Okay, all right. So thanks, Danny and Victoria, for giving us your time today. I'm looking forward to hear what you guys have put together for us.
Awesome, thank you for that introduction, Cheryl. It's good to see so many faces. I've never seen this many faces on the Zoom call. So I'm Danny, and Victoria, you want to say hi?
Yeah, hi, I'm Victoria. So today we're going to talk to you, like Cheryl said, about intentional aging and nutrition. Next slide.
All right, I'll introduce myself first. I'm Danny Beery. I was born and raised in Silverdale, Washington, so I'm from the same area code. Before graduate school, I worked at a homeless youth shelter. I cooked a bunch of meals and prepared educational materials. I like to skate. I like to be outdoorsy. I like to read. And my research interests are studying the effect of nutrition on the pathophysiology of depression. And with that, I'm going to let Victoria introduce herself a bit.
Yeah, my name is Victoria. I'm from Corvallis, Oregon, so not that far away, but recent transplant to Seattle for grad school with my also recent husband. We just got married in September. He's there on the left with me on the e-bike. I like to ride my bicycle, and I also love to travel. That picture of me and the elephants, that's when my husband was working in Thailand and I got to go visit him. And I love to bake. In my undergrad, I studied agricultural sciences and I worked in a wheat quality lab and got to do research on sourdough whole wheat test bake methods. And now I'm currently working as a research assistant at UW, looking at farmers' perspectives on climate change and food systems programs in higher education. Next slide. Okay, so today we're going to talk about nutrition changes as we age. We're going to focus on 3 main areas: maintaining and improving muscle mass, improving cognitive function, and then we'll wrap it up by looking at how we can assess nutrition information, and so that you can make well-informed decisions that align with your nutrition goals. Next slide. So the hope is by the end of the session, you'll have a better understanding of how nutrition can fit into your intentional aging strategy. And as you age, a lot of things change. In regards to nutrition, in the general population, aging often leads to a decrease in physical activity, which results in a domino effect of slowing metabolism, decrease in energy requirements, and often eating less. We also see in older populations that we tend to have a decrease in ability to absorb and utilize many nutrients. And so that leads to an increase in nutrient needs. Chronic conditions and medications can also affect nutrition requirements by impacting nutrient absorption, by impacting your appetite, ability to move, etc. And then also it's common to see tooth and mouth problems impacting the ability to chew and swallow, which can lead to a decrease in food intake and make it more difficult to enjoy foods. So we're going to start by focusing on maintaining muscle mass, because while we would like to address all the things we just mentioned before, we don't have time for all of them. And so why is maintaining and increasing muscle mass important for intentional aging? Well, we're going to look at specifically today, preventing and addressing sarcopenia, which I'll explain in the next slide. And then we'll look at why nutrition is important in maintaining and increasing muscle mass. And we're going to talk about and focus on protein. We'll look at how we can increase protein intake, and then we'll wrap it up with looking at some good sources of protein, vegan and vegetarian ones as well. So while there are many underlying causes of sarcopenia, I'm just kind of curious, and if you want to practice using the raise hand function, who here has heard of sarcopenia? Okay. I see a few hands, great. So sarcopenia is just an accelerated loss of muscle, and this is commonly seen in aging populations. Older individuals are more at risk for sarcopenia because as we age, muscle mass decreases 3 to 6% after the age of 30. Next slide. There are many underlying causes for sarcopenia, and I have a bunch of them listed here. There's some causes that are going to be out of our control, disorders and diseases, hospital admission, et cetera. But using nutrition to address sarcopenia is an avenue that I hope you can leave this presentation feeling a bit more empowered in your ability to utilize, since there's a vast amount of evidence supporting the role of nutrition in preventing sarcopenia and sarcopenia-related issues. Next slide.
Victoria,
Okay.
can I jump in real quick? I definitely see some note takers in the group, and that's great if they're wanting to, but we are going to send the slides out, so you'll have all this information shared with you as well. So thank you. Sorry. So why is nutrition important in maintaining and increasing muscle mass and preventing sarcopenia? There is some early research looking at different nutrients and how they affect sarcopenia and muscle mass, including antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. But this research is still very limited and very young. There's a little bit more research looking at vitamin D and muscle mass, and that's a bit more conclusive. There seems to be some evidence that vitamin D supplementation can increase muscle strength, but that's mainly in individuals who are vitamin D deficient. So today we're going to look at the nutrient that is most known to influence muscle mass, and that is protein. Next slide. But in order to talk about protein, we have to get a little bit of context, and we need to talk about amino acids. I'll ask again, maybe we'll do another raise hand. Who here has heard of amino acids? Okay, we've got a few individuals, great. So what are amino acids? Well, they are essential to all living things, and they are the building blocks of proteins. Next slide.
People often think of protein as a mass noun, a homogeneous substance that you need to have a part of your diet, but protein is much more complex. Not only do you need protein to build muscle, but it is also important for your body's enzymes, for hormone signaling, for things like insulin, and also for your body's defenses. Next slide. There are 20 types of amino acids that make up a human protein. Some of these, which are known as the essential acids, amino acids, our body cannot make, and we have to consume through our diet. We also have non-essential amino acids, which our body can synthesize, but we can also consume through our diet as well. Next slide. So you might be wondering, where do we get our amino acids? Well, we get them from everything we eat. Some of the foods that we eat have more amino acids than others or different ratios, but everything essentially has them. I'm going to pause. I see some hands raised, and I don't know if that's from before or if they're questions. Okay, I think they're from before. No worries. So this leads to this slide, which is saying at the top, you can see the nutritional value of a protein depends on the amount and balance of the essential amino acids it contains. Now, I don't want you to take this statement and think that some proteins are quote unquote better than others. That's not what is meant here by value, but rather value means that proteins provide a different message to your body based on what type of amino acids it contains. Next slide. And this I just threw in for a fun little tidbit. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, but they're also really, really important to taste. So whether you taste something bitter or sour or sweet, that's all because of amino acids. Next slide. Okay, so what does this mean for your food choices and increasing protein intake? If you've eaten vegetarian for a while, which I know a lot of you mentioned in the pre-survey we sent out a few weeks ago, you've probably heard of this idea of complementary proteins, or you've been told that you can't have a rounded diet without including complete proteins. So do you want to hit the next button so that the proteins, yeah, and one more again, there. So just like the Pig's Decree in Animal Farm, I don't know if you've all read that book. I remember reading that in middle school, but they said all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. That's just not true. And the same thing for proteins. All proteins are not more equal than others. Next slide. So as previously mentioned, there are 9 essential amino acids, and these 9 essential amino acids are necessary to have a complete protein. Proteins that are sufficient in all of these are what you see here, include mostly animal products, but a few vegetarian options include soy products like tofu and soy milk, and then also buckwheat and quinoa. Next slide. Some plant-based protein sources are low in a few specific amino acids, specifically lysine and methionine, which you don't have to remember, but the point is that those are essential amino acids. And so grains tend to be higher in methionine, but low in lysine. And then legumes, your beans and lentils, tend to be high in lysine, but low in methionine. And because of this, this concept of protein combining emerged as a way to make sure that you were getting all the amino acids you needed. But the human body is really, really smart. And this idea that you need to eat all those 9 essential amino acids in one meal, we've learned is not the case. If you simply eat them throughout the day, your body will be able to handle the rest. The amino acids pool in our body, and our body has a constant turnover of proteins, so they fill in those minor gaps if you're not consuming enough amino acid on like one given meal, but you eat a little bit more in the next. And so what I hope you can take away from this is that some proteins are not more equal than others. And if you consume a varied diet of all foods, it's possible to get all the amino acids you need for your protein requirements. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to provide some examples here because I know that was a big request in the survey of plant-based protein options. You'll see on the right, there's a list of different plant-based food sources that have protein, including nut butters, tempeh, soy products, peas. And then the pictures kind of show some of that idea of what people use with the protein combining different foods that have different types of proteins in them. So we've got some toast and nut butter, we've got hummus and pita bread, beans and rice, barley, bean soup, and then I think at the bottom left, it looks like some seed mixing for a granola bar. Next slide. And to wrap up this discussion on the protein, I wanted to just provide this equation to look at so you can calculate your own protein needs. So the protein requirement for the average adult is 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. So if someone weighs 143 pounds, that's roughly 65 kilograms, then their general protein requirement would be 52 to 65 grams per day. But for individuals over the age of 60, it's actually recommended that they lean towards that higher number, so 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. Next slide. So I thought if we wanted to take a few minutes to try this out, we could practice. You want to go to the next slide? So I have a chart here that has the conversion of grams to kilograms, or sorry, kilograms to pounds. And so if you are, say, 172 pounds, Danny, if you can hover over 172 pounds with your mouse, yeah, then you're going to be, that's going to be 78 kilograms. And for age groups over 60, you're looking at 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. So that means you're going to be looking at 79 grams of protein per day. So I'll just give you all a minute to try and figure that out. And if you want, do you want to hit the next button, Danny? Yeah, if you want to put in the chat, was that number more, less, or about what you expected your protein requirements to be? I see a hand raised. Beverly.
Okay, I just unmuted. I don't know how to figure out, say, for instance, how much 49 kilograms is in pounds or ounces. Like if I was going to get some food, I don't know what 48 kilograms looks like.
Oh, okay, so
you have pounds.
It would be, yeah. So this is for your own body weight. So for me, I weigh 145 pounds. So I'll round up to 146 pounds. Mm-hmm. That is 66 kilograms in the chart. And then I would multiply that by 1, which is 66. And that would be 66 grams. There's you have to do some crossing out of, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the words for grams and kilograms, units. There we go. Yeah.
So we need like a food scale, a European style food scale to figure out grams.
Yes, but also if you look at your food labels, it'll tell you on the nutrition facts, and I probably should have put a picture of that on here. Didn't think about that, but on the nutrition facts, it'll tell you how many grams of protein is in a food product. So you can use that, to calculate how much protein you're consuming per day about. But another great way is if you don't have the nutrition facts label, you can go onto the internet and you can search how much protein, how many grams of protein is in a cup of beans. And Google has some calculators and they'll tell you how much protein is in, the amount of product you're asking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think Judith was next. Judith, did you have a question?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself.
No worries.
I use MyFitnessPal because I have to track certain nutrients, and for the macronutrients, including protein, it measures them, or you can set your goals in terms of percentage of what you eat daily, like 20%, 30% or whatever. So can you translate that in any way, or how would we do that?
Okay, that's a great question. So that would depend. I would have to see, you would have to look at all the other percent, like grams and requirements. So you're looking for each macronutrient, but I know what you mean. So I think that in MyFitnessPal, you can either choose the percent option, or if you wanted to use a calculation like this and determine your protein requirements in grams, you should be able to input the number of grams you want to eat per day of protein, and then it'll adjust it in MyFitnessPal. But I'm not super familiar with that app. So.
I think not in the free version, unfortunately.
Okay.
And it used to be $9 a month for the paid version, and now it's $19.99.
Yeah. Sorry.
This is Cheryl. If we don't, we could probably send something in our follow-up that maybe talks about that question.
Yeah.
If we don't have that completely answered right now, there may be some other resources we can share that would explain kind of that breakdown. And then I also wanted to point out, I put in the chat a link to the FDA.gov that talks about nutrition labels, and that there's an example one if you scroll down that shows that all those numbers are reported in grams on those nutrition labels, which you won't find on your Apple, but there are ways to get that information if you're concerned with it.
Yeah. Thank you, Cheryl. And then I think Cynthia has a question.
Yes, I've read something into, that's not my barking, by the way, it's somebody else's. I have read some things in regards to how much protein that your body can actually utilize per meal or per sitting. And I was wondering if you were going to address that.
Yeah,
Like,
so
they can only utilize so much protein in an hour period or something to that effect.
yes, so that's actually a really good point. And the research on building muscle mass and sarcopenia is pointing towards making sure you spread that protein out throughout the day, rather than eating all, like, for me, how much protein did I say I needed? I need like 66 grams of protein a day. I shouldn't eat that 66 grams of protein in one steak just for dinner, right? You want to spread that throughout the day. And kind of going back to what I was pointing out with the very different types of proteins and mixing them and eating them in different meals. Yeah, having that space through, maybe you have some eggs for breakfast, and then at lunch you have lentil soup, which might be a little bit less protein than the eggs at breakfast. But then in the evening you have some beans and some rice and maybe a little bit of chicken or something like that, right? So yeah, spreading the protein throughout the day is definitely more advantageous than eating it all in one sitting. That was a great question. Okay, does anyone else have any other questions?
I've read that the amount of protein you need eating animal products differs from the amount of protein you need eating non-animal products.
So yeah, if we, let's see, Danny, do you want to go back to the slide? The one with all the, yeah, that one, that's great. Perfect. So kind of what I was trying to get at with the idea that all proteins are equal, but some are more equal than others. There was an idea that complete proteins, which mainly come from animal products, which have all those 9 amino acids, were somehow better because they had all the 9 amino acids. But many vegetarian sources of proteins just have different ratios. And as long as you consume a varied diet where you're getting a little bit of all the amino acids through the different food products you eat, it is totally completely fine for your body, and your body will be able to gain what it needs from those sources. Does that make sense?
I think it was more of an uptake issue, that depending on what else you're eating, that the plant protein may be more bioavailable than some of the animal protein.
Okay, yeah, so in terms of bioavailability, that I don't have much information on that. I don't know if Danny, you have any thoughts on the bioavailability of protein, but I'm happy to do some research and send out a follow-up for that as well.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
So
I just want to, there's one more question in the chat. Victoria, maybe you can answer. Is it possible to eat too much protein, and is that dangerous?
yeah, that's another great question. So your body doesn't store protein in the way it stores fats and carbohydrates. So it will excrete it, but there is also research on excess protein intake being damaging to the body. But again, that's not an area that I have a ton of knowledge in. So I can also, if someone wants follow-up information, I'm happy to add more in that as well. Okay, so the last little bit about protein before we go on to Danny's portion. Oh, there's another comment in the chat. Yes, yeah, so there's the question in the chat is protein intake can depend on whether you have certain health problems such as heart and kidney. Yes, exactly. And like, so kind of protein, what I was mentioning earlier is that, or just before this, with protein potentially being damaging, individuals with kidney disease can have a harder time with high protein diets. That's something that has been seen in the research as well. Okay, so I just wanted to bring this slide up, and because your next presentation is going to be on movement and exercise. And so this idea that the synergy of nutritional and physical exercise interventions go hand in hand when you're looking at increasing muscle mass and addressing sarcopenia. And this is because in order to build muscle mass and maintain muscle mass, you have to tear it apart, which is what exercise is doing. So, you know, you pick up that dumbbell, you do some curls, and that's damaging your muscles. And then after the damage is made, you go home and you consume a meal and hopefully have some protein. And those nutrients help those muscles repair and grow back bigger. Next slide. Oh yeah, so I added this here. I really appreciate this concept of like when you start, you know, looking at incorporating nutrition and physical activity together, the idea shouldn't be you're moving so that you can eat. The idea should be that you're eating so that you can move your body. Next slide. And so I just wanted to post in here some synergy inspiration of older adults who move their bodies. On the top left, this is Mary Duffy, who started weightlifting in her 60s, and she has an Instagram account now. I definitely cannot do a plank with that many plates on top of me. And then Martin Legner on the bottom left is a Paralympics wheelchair tennis player, and he's been playing in the Paralympics since 1992. And so I think he played in the most recent one at the age of 60, in his 60s. Ida Keeling in the bottom right started running in her mid-age years and was setting track records and walking records into her hundreds. And then the top right corner there, that's actually me in the bike helmet, but I wanted to point out my mom and my grandpa. My mom likes to move through Zumba and walking, and my grandpa goes on walks every day with his same crew of five gentlemen every morning around the track. So yeah, hopefully you can take this into your next presentation a little bit, since I think the concepts really overlap well. Okay, next slide. Oh, you're muted, Danny.
A rookie mistake. Thanks, Victoria. We're going to move on to improving cognitive function through nutritional strategies. And so I titled this section Cognitive Function, Brain Health, and Nutrition. And the two basic questions I want to answer are, how does nutrition relate to cognitive function? And how can we improve nutrition-related behaviors that are associated with better cognitive function? So why would nutrition even affect cognitive function in the first place? Like, why would some foods influence cognitive functions and other foods don't seem to have an effect on cognitive function? Well, at the most basic level, a way a nutrient can affect cognitive function is either serving as an energy source for the brain or serving as a building block for the brain. We know that the brain is primarily made up of fat, and in particular, certain types of fats that come from healthy foods. as well as some of the signaling molecules and structures in the brain, including neurotransmitters, which you may have heard of, are made up of amino acids from proteins, amino acids that Victoria just described. And another way that nutrients can improve cognitive function is that they act as adaptive stressors. So adaptive stressors are stressors that may be harmful or have no effect in higher amounts, but may be beneficial in lower amounts. In other words, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Some examples of adaptive stressors you see all the time are exercise, vaccines, saunas. But another form of adaptive stress that I want to introduce are these things called phytonutrients. So phytonutrients are basically compounds in plants that provide health benefits. It's a very broad definition, but phyto means plant. And many phytonutrients act as health promoting compounds in a manner similar to exercise. So many plants have these compounds in them that they use to protect against insects, to protect against UV radiation or bacteria. And when we consume those phytonutrients, they kind of they're like an acute stress on our body, but our body adapts to that stress and becomes more resilient. And so here's some phytonutrients that have been shown in clinical trials to improve cognitive function. And I call these your low-hanging fruit because they're very accessible and easy to add to your diet. Some examples are green tea and coffee. These are drinks that you can have as a part of your morning routine, a part of your social routine. And then things like cocoa, which you can add to breakfast foods, to milk, to drinks, and other things like turmeric and ground cayenne and chili peppers, you can add to your culinary dishes. And some other foods that have been shown to improve cognitive function are blue and purple foods. So these foods have phytonutrients such as resveratrol and anthocyanins, which are, they give the plants their pigments, and they're the reason these plants are blue and purple. And there's actually quite a bit of research showing that these compounds improve cognitive function. So foods such as grapes, rhubarb, berries, red onions, red cabbage. Again, you don't even need to memorize which foods have these compounds. You just have to look at them and see whether are these foods blue and purple and are they plant foods. And then there's another group of cognitive function improving compounds known as phytoestrogens. So again, phyto means plants, estrogens, a sex hormone. These foods include soy products, which contain these compounds called isoflavones. Soy products include edamame, soybeans, tofu, natto, tempeh. And then lignin containing foods contain flax, either in the form of ground flax seeds or whole flax seeds, as well as sesame and sesame seeds. And so these are more of your staple foods, and they're not too difficult to integrate into your diet. And then there's these two compounds that are gaining a lot of attention recently for improving cognitive function, and they're called lutein and zeaxanthin. You don't need to memorize the names of these compounds, but just know they can be found in dark leafy greens, some herbs such as basil and parsley, as well as avocados and eggs. There's actually studies showing that when you consume avocados and eggs with these other lutein and zeaxanthin containing foods, it actually increases the absorption of them, which is really cool. And we also know that these compounds actually accumulate in the macula of your eye. So they're really important for preventing eye-related diseases. But now a lot of emerging evidence is showing that these compounds actually improve cognitive function in both healthy younger adults as well as older adults. Now, transitioning away from phytonutrients, I just want to ask everybody, what do all these foods have in common? Besides, obviously they're going to improve cognitive function, and obviously they're very expensive, but what else do these foods have in common? Yeah, sure. Deb?
Oh, you're muted, Deb.
Fat, healthy fats.
Yeah, you nailed it. So we have salmon, avocado, flaxseed, almonds, walnuts, pumpkin seeds, olive oil, all have healthy fats. And in particular, they have a type of fat called omega-3 fatty acids. So you may have heard of omega-3s because of their cardiovascular benefits or their anti-inflammatory properties, but there's actually quite a big body of literature that supports that omega-3s, particularly from animal sources, improve cognitive function. So animal sources contain EPA and DHA, and these sources include fish and seafood. Oh yeah, sure, Deb.
So I read that there are probably three nutrients or vitamins that you should consider taking. One was omega-3 and the other was vitamin D. And I think the other one was just a multivitamin. Is it, if you're eating a well-rounded diet and you don't have absorption issues, do you see a need to take a supplement?
If you're getting fish in your diet, I would probably guess there's no need to supplement, right? But I would always,
Okay.
anything supplementation, in fact, anything dietary as well, I would always encourage people to make sure they check in with their healthcare professional first, because Victoria and I are students. We're not healthcare professionals. We're not even dietitians yet. So always clear stuff with your healthcare professional. Okay, and in addition to animal sources of omega-3s, there's plant sources of omega-3s, and these contain a type of fat called ALA. And this can be found in chia, flax, hemp seeds, walnuts, and pecans. And these fats can transition to the EPA and DHA that are found in animal sources, but the conversion rate is very low, like 5 to 10%. And so that's why some health professionals encourage supplementation with either fish oil and krill oil. Algae and krill oil are great vegetarian, vegan options, but they might come at a higher price point than fish oil. And someone just raised their hand. Cynthia? Sorry, you're on mute.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to thank you for pointing out the research about for instance, like salmon being, so to speak, a superior source of the omega-3s because of the research with the EPA and the DHA and the very, very low conversion from plant sources like walnuts, because I tried to tell people that before, but I read that research a few years ago, but that information is not out there. People aren't aware of it. So thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks for really driving that point home. And that's not to say that you shouldn't eat plant sources of omega-3s. They have other phytonutrients and other great compounds in them. And ALA might have other health benefits that are not as well studied, but definitely EPA and DHA seem to be the compounds that support cognitive function, are great for the heart, and have anti-inflammatory effects. And then I just want to
the algae oil,
go for it.
the algae oil, isn't the algae where the fish get their EPA and DHA?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
why wouldn't, so how do people's absorption of algae compare? I mean, you talked about walnuts, but what about going to the source for the fish?
Yeah, so algae has those EPA and DHA forms, and you nailed it. So like the fish eat the algae to get the EPA and DHA. So algae is straight from the source, but the supplement forms are more expensive when you get them as algae oil rather than fish oil, and I think that's just like a supply and demand type thing. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
But I eat the algae. I don't take supplements.
I gotcha. That's a great idea. I wish I ate more algae too. All right, I just see one question. I've read that grass-fed beef has much more omega-3 than grain-fed beef, which is much higher in omega-6. Is there a difference to make a difference in our nutrition? Yeah, so I just want to talk about your question. So omega-6 is like this other type of fatty acid, and your ratio of omega-3 and omega-6 seems to influence like the inflammatory status of the body, with the omega-6s being more pro-inflammatory and omega-3s being more anti-inflammatory. And we know that the standard ratio in the American diet is about 16:1 omega-3s or omega-6s to omega-3s, whereas historically it was closer to 4:1 or 1:1. So there seems to be the shift towards more omega-6s, right? And that's more of a pro-inflammatory profile. And you're absolutely right that grass-fed beef has a higher ratio of omega-6 to omega-3s. In fact, the research shows it's about like a 7.5 to 1 ratio. Meanwhile, grain-fed meat has that higher omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of 7.5 to 1, whereas grass-fed beef has that more optimal range of 1 to 1. And I can follow up and share some of that information with Cheryl after the talk, but thanks for bringing that up. And I just want to talk about olive oil because it's kind of like a combination of healthy fats and phytonutrients. And there's actually quite a bit of literature showing that replacing vegetable oils with olive oil, particularly extra virgin olive oil, improve cognitive function in older adults after 1 year. And there's another study showing that people on this diet called the Mediterranean diet, when they were given nuts versus olive oil, they showed improvements in cognitive function on the olive oil diet. So there seems to be like these compounds, or whether it's the phytonutrients or the healthy fats that promote cognitive function. And just to recap on all the foods that we just talked about, you don't have to memorize which foods improve cognitive function, or which nutrients improve cognitive function, but just think of foods that might be sort of adaptive stressors. So foods that grow up in environments where there's sunlight, where there's insects, where there's bacteria. And so some of the foods I just talked about were coffee and tea, spices such as cocoa, turmeric, cayenne pepper, herbs, parsley and basil, blue and purple foods. Talked about berries, grapes, rhubarb, and then as well as your healthy fats like walnuts, avocado, and olive oil. And then I also want to mention that there's tens of thousands of phytonutrients, and there's no way we're going to study all of them and study how they affect cognitive function. And there's a lot of nutrients that have been shown to improve cognitive function in animal studies, but haven't been shown to improve cognitive function in human studies. So there might be thousands of nutrients out there that improve cognitive function that we just haven't studied. So you don't necessarily have to only eat these foods if your interest is cognitive function, but I'm just pointing out what the evidence shows us right now. And I also mentioned that omega-3s, especially the animal sources from fish and seafood, have been shown to improve cognitive function. But you can also eat plant sources that are less bioavailable, but there's always supplementation in the form of fish oil and algae oil. And now, as a little bridge into our next topic, I just want to talk about health-related behavioral changes and some mindsets that seem to be associated with facilitating health-related behavioral changes. So Victoria and I in our class are studying this construct called social behavioral theory. And two of the constructs are self-efficacy and outcome expectations. Self-efficacy is just the belief that you can do something. Meanwhile, outcome expectations are what do you expect is going to happen if I do that behavior? And what's may seem obvious, but it's really cool when you see the literature, is that self-efficacy and outcome expectations are actually associated with better food purchases and better food consumption behaviors. So people who believe that they can eat healthy, eat healthier, and people who believe that healthy food will make them healthier tend to eat better, which again seems kind of intuitive and obvious, but it's kind of cool when you see the studies showing it does so. So these two concepts kind of bridge knowledge and behavior. So they bridge knowing what's good for us and actually doing what's good for us. And some tips I want to share for improving self-efficacy. So the belief that you can do something is to become a lifelong learner. I think you're all probably lifelong learners just by the fact that you're a part of this intentional aging community. I think Cheryl is a great example going back to grad school later in life. So she's always a great model of how to become a lifelong learner. And social support, there's quite a bit of evidence showing that giving social positive reinforcement to other people improves their self-efficacy. So you're all part of this intentional aging community, and I encourage you all to give and receive positive reinforcement. And lastly, I just want to suggest focusing on mastery of behaviors rather than performance. So let's say your goal is, I want to drink green tea every single day for a year, and you only do it 300 days of that year. That doesn't necessarily mean you failed in your goal. It just means that you're getting closer to mastering that behavior of drinking tea every single day. Okay, and the next topic I want to get to is, how do we assess nutrition information, and how do we decide what's best for us? I call this finding the signal in the noise. So there's so much noise going on, but we just want to find that signal that actually means something to us. And the 3 questions I want to answer are, what are the various sources of nutrition info? How do we weigh info to make conclusions? And what do we do in the presence of limited or inconsistent information? And how does misinformation spread? So there's many sources of nutrition information, and they're obviously not all equal, but it's important to know what's out there. So there's personal experience, there's anecdotal evidence, there's scientific evidence, there's expert opinions, there's news outlets, social media, and of course, your most credible nutritional source is your healthcare provider, or I would hope so. So how do we weigh information? So I kind of have like this 3-step protocol that I use for deciding what's best for me, given all the information. And the reason I use this protocol, because it buffers us from this thing called the anchoring effect, which is kind of our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information that we hear. So if someone is like, you should drink 3 cups of coffee a day, you're more likely to believe that you should drink 2.5 cups of coffee than 1 cup of coffee. And a classic example of the anchoring effect is when people are asked, like, was Gandhi 104 when he died? And then they're asked, how old was Gandhi when he died? They're more likely to suggest a higher number than somebody who was asked, was Gandhi 44 when he died? And how old was Gandhi when he died? So the reason I use this 3-step process is to prevent this anchoring effect. And it's well described in this book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's a great book about our own biases and our intuitive thinking. And so the 3 steps I recommend is to first evaluate your sources, and then choose an appropriate anchor, and then adjust your conclusions based on other pieces of information. And we're gonna walk us through an example. So I too am part of the intentional aging community. I want to live to 100. So my example is, how much coffee should I drink if I want to live to 100? And so my health goal is, I want to live to 100. My health related behavior is coffee consumption. And my question is, how many cups of coffee should I drink per day if I want to live to 100? So I gather all the information that I have at my disposal. The first is my personal experience. I feel great when I drink 1 to 2 cups of coffee per day. Well, let's say my grandma, who's 90 years old and is doing great, drinks 1 cup of coffee a day. But I read this research paper that says your lowest risk of death is drinking 3.5 cups a day. And meanwhile, a personal trainer who I might know says don't drink coffee at all. So I have 4 pieces of 4 sources saying something different, and I'm going to walk us through how I recommend coming up with the conclusion. So the first thing is to evaluate all your sources. So when I evaluate my own personal experience, I decide that I'm a little biased because I might be addicted to coffee. I drink coffee every day. Thinking about my grandma, other factors might contribute to her longevity. She's very active in the church. She moves around a lot. Thinking about the scientific evidence, this goes back to what Cheryl's activity at the beginning. Nutritionists told me eggs were bad, and now they're telling me eggs are good. Can I trust them? And maybe this personal trainer, maybe he knows a lot about exercise, but I don't really believe he knows anything about nutrition. And so I'm going to set an appropriate anchor. And because I'm a nutritional sciences student and I trust some of the scientific evidence, I'm going to use that as my anchor. So I set at 3.5 cups of coffee because that's what the study recommended. And then I'm going to adjust my conclusion based on all the other pieces of information. So first I considered a personal trainer's advice, and I determined he doesn't know anything about nutrition, so I didn't change my recommendation. And then I assessed the anecdotal evidence. So my grandma only drinks 1 cup of coffee. So I think about lowering my conclusion to 3 cups of coffee a day. And then from my personal experience, I feel best when I drink 1 to 2. So I'm going to bring it down another half cup. And then I decide that I'm going to drink 2.5 cups of coffee a day in order to live to 100. And the reason I walk us through that example is because if you take your personal trainer's advice, who was the first piece of information you heard, and you set your anchor at 0, you're more likely to come up with the final conclusion of about 1 to like 1.5 cups of coffee. So depending on your anchor, you're going to come up with a different conclusion, but it's so important that you're the one who consciously decides what your anchor is. And now I'm going to just talk about how do you make conclusions with limited information. So on things such as cognitive function or even fields such as longevity, there's not a lot of nutritional information out there. So we might have to rely more heavily on our personal experience or our anecdotal evidence and set that as our anchor. But it's always important to establish a degree of certainty or degree of confidence. So let's say I made a conclusion of 2.5 cups of coffee a day, but I'll give an arbitrary 40% confidence in that conclusion. But what's more important is to decide what info I would need to see to change my view. So if I saw more studies that supported that conclusion or supported a different conclusion, then I would decide ahead of time that's the information I want to see if I want to change my conclusion. And another thing that's very difficult about nutritional science is how inconsistent some of the studies seem to be. You see that so many times with the meat-based versus plant-based diets. You hear so much like, should we eat eggs or should we not eat eggs? Full fat dairy versus fat-free dairy. All these debates are highly contested, and there seems to be no consistency in any way, shape, or form. But some tools you can use to kind of decide what's best for you is to understand your sources, understand their motivations, and understand their agendas. So we actually know that 13% of nutrition research studies are supported by funding by the food industry. So if you're reading a study or you're reading a news article that came out of a study, and you find out that study was funded by the meat and dairy industry, then you might not be able to trust that study or that news article, and you might have to look for another piece of information. Something that's also important is to find information relevant to you and your situation. So if you see a study or news article saying that meat-based diets are great, and they're saying this because they observed that it improved cognitive function in 18-year-old football players, like that might not be relevant to you and your situation, both in terms of age, maybe in terms of gender. Medications is a big influencer of whether a diet is going to be good for you. So there's so many other variables, and you want to make sure these pieces of information are relevant to you and your situation. And it's always helpful to fall back on your anecdotal evidence and your personal experience. So if you're eating a plant-based diet and all your friends are eating a plant-based diet and you're doing well, then I would recommend not changing that. Then we're just going to walk through a quick case study in how misinformation can spread. And so I just found this study, this scientific paper talking about this diet called the MIND diet. And the paper found that the MIND diet was associated with better cognitive function. And that's been shown in previous studies with the MIND diet. There's also some evidence to show that the MIND diet reduces one's risk of Alzheimer's disease. But this study specifically showed that the MIND diet was not associated with brain pathology. So just markers of the brain associated with Alzheimer's disease. And the reason I chose this specific study in particular is because 4 different articles came out of this study, and they all had a different conclusion. And I'm going to show you those papers. But quickly, I want to talk about what the MIND diet is. So the MIND diet was basically researchers found all the foods that have been shown to improve cognitive function, put them together, and eliminated all the foods that have been shown to be associated with poor cognitive function, and just combined them together and just saw, does this diet improve cognitive function? And it turns out, yes, it does. But here's the 4 different news headlines that came out of that same study. So the first 2 say that the MIND diet may guard against Alzheimer's disease. And clearly the study said the MIND diet is not associated with brain pathologies related to Alzheimer's disease. So those headlines, you can't make those headlines based off that study. But then Science Daily, the third headline, which is one of my trusted sources, said that the MIND diet is linked to better cognitive performance, which the study did. That's what the data from the study did say. But then there's this fourth news article that says that the MIND diet may slow cognitive decline in people with Alzheimer's disease. And that's not what the study showed. In fact, the study used healthy adults without Alzheimer's disease. So that conclusion cannot be made from that study. So that's just an example of, you'll have one study and all these news articles will rush onto that same study and they'll make claims that aren't substantiated by the data. Okay, and just to recap, deciding what's best for us. So first, just to set a goal and choose a health-related behavior. Then gather all the relevant information, and then evaluate sources, choose an appropriate anchor, and adjust your conclusions based on other pieces of information. And then there's always a disclaimer that there's no guarantee your conclusion will be right. There's so many factors that influence nutrition and influence health. So sometimes you won't know if the nutritional strategy is best for whatever outcome you're interested in, but I think having a process ensures that our conclusion is most likely to be right. It's also important to be open to changing your conclusion based on new information. So with that, I just want to wrap this up. So we went over maintaining muscle mass, improving cognitive performance, and assessing nutrition information. But I just wanted to share Victoria and I's kind of billboard materials. Though, if there's one thing we want people to remember as they're leaving this Zoom call, it's just that nutrition is inherently tied to intentional aging, and that you have the power to decide what food choices fit your goals. You don't have to be like Victoria and I and go to graduate school to learn about nutrition to understand what's best for you. You have information at your disposal. And you have the ability to decide what foods are going to help you reach your goals. So with that, I just want to open up to questions, comments. The floor is yours.
And I realize, Cheryl, that we've kind of gone a little bit over, so I'm not quite sure how that works.
Fine. You're totally
Okay.
fine. Yeah.
I did want to, before another question pops up, I noticed there was a question in the chat about MDs might not be getting adequate nutrition education in their own education. And so how do you work with that? And then I think also someone mentioned here that it can be difficult to get a consult with a dietitian when you're on Medicare. So I think these are great things that were brought up. I think it's one thing that's really important to remember about, working with a physician is that, yeah, that's true. The physicians are great wealths of knowledge, and they are there to help you be the healthiest individual you can be, but they don't do that alone. They always work on a team. So my older sister is a physician and going through this journey to become a registered dietitian. I've had many conversations with her. And there have been times when she has asked me questions. And so realizing that any physician you work with has a team of individuals that they are also working with too, to then parlay information with you. And I think another thing that is really important to remember is that you can ask your physician questions or your registered dietitian questions, and they will be then more than happy to address your questions and concerns and work with you. So remembering that being with a physician is not a one-way street. You have the power and ability to ask those questions as well. But so I hope that addresses that. And I think in the terms of, Medicare might not make it available for you to work with a registered dietitian. Looking at, and this was maybe a place where Cheryl might have more information, but looking within your community where those resources are, where you can get nutrition education and information outside of the hospital setting. So I know like in Seattle, the Tilth Alliance does a lot of education and on nutrition and cooking classes in the greater Seattle area. I'm not quite sure what might be some example places that do that where you all live, but maybe that's what Cheryl could provide that kind of information. So I hope that answers a little bit of that question that was in the chat.
All right.
I was going to say, and a follow up to that, Victoria, real quick, I did drop the link into the Medicare page, which basically reiterated what I can't remember who posted, if it was Cynthia or somebody else on that, but I also dropped in another great place to start, especially if you're not with your provider, is Medline Plus. We'll link out to a lot of quality sources. Same thing, as you start to follow link after link after link, you want to use those criteria Danny was talking about to really know what you're looking at and accessing there. But that's a good place to start for quality medical information and resources. Okay, sorry, Danny. Jump
I was
back.
just talking about the shout out Medline Plus because you mentioned it, but I also just want to mention I know Cheryl said this in previous talks that like me and Victoria are just two people, and we have one perspective looking at the nutrition research. So there's more perspectives out there, and there's always a possibility that we're wrong about some of the things we're talking about. So just we always encourage people to do their own research and always consult with their trusted medical professionals. Does anyone have any questions?
Tapped in. All right, let's see. So we had a couple of questions that I'll work with Victoria and Danny and follow up with our follow-up email. Does anybody else have any more questions right now on their presentation portion of this? We've got about 15 minutes left. I've got a few things to highlight for anybody who still has time to hang on, but I don't want to cut off the question piece, and definitely want to tell you guys thank you. That was great. Had a lot of information that you packed into a short amount of time, and really, really appreciate the work you put into that for us. It's great. Do my little applause. Yeah. So, all right. So it looks like we've hit on all the questions for now. So, oh yeah, thanks, Joy. Like that. We do have about 15 more minutes for anybody that wants to hang on. I have a few other resources that I plan to share, and I just wanted to highlight a few cookbooks in particular from the library's collection that might be of interest to the group. One of the things that happens as kids fly the nest, you find that you're cooking for one or two people, that there's a need for thinking about ways to prepare these healthy meals and foods for yourself. So I have a few tips that I wanted to share regarding that, and I will send this out with our follow-up email. One of the first suggestions is thinking about planning meals based on a set of ingredients. And so, you purchase basil one week and it will only last less than a week. Figuring out a few meals that you're using those particular fresh herbs. So maybe you pick a fresh herb a week and you pick 2 or 3 meals that you'll be utilizing that. But when you buy ingredients, thinking about ways that you can use them in multiple meals. Thinking about ways to keep some staple items on hand. You can buy cooking basics in bulk, maybe not Costco size bulk, but we do have a few resources here where you can purchase also in bulk foods like Country Air and Sunny Farms. So maybe grains and things like that, you don't have to over purchase. You can purchase just as much as you need. I personally keep a set of canning jars in my garage, and that's if I buy a pound of something. Yes, excellent, Cynthia. You can freeze fresh herbs, which is a great way to do that. And so that's one way to pre-plan for that. Utilizing your deli counter, paying attention to what's in the items you're buying there is important, but it does allow you to get the exact amount you need. And it's okay to only buy one piece of produce. Maybe you're making something that you need just an apple for, but you're not necessarily a regular apple eater, then you can buy that one apple. So there's a lot of different suggestions in here. The one thing I will include in this follow-up is ways to scale down recipes. Maybe you do have some favorite family recipes that cook for 6 or 8. The guidelines that I have are how to make half of a recipe, how to make a third of a recipe, and also just some measurement conversions. I'll include that in our follow-up supporting document. And let's see, did anybody have any specific questions about cooking for 1 or 2 at this point that they had, or anything you would like me to make sure I send out in follow-up resources? You guys all of a sudden got quiet on me. All right. So I think I'll just do a little quick reader's advisory with some of the books that I have found in the collection. This one is, and I'll list these in the email too. This one's called Serve Yourself, and it's Joe Yonan, and he is a James Beard award-winning food editor for the Washington Post, and he has 100 recipes for both weeknight staples and weeknight projects. And so the idea behind it is nightly adventures cooking for 1. And this is another one that I found called Solo Suppers. So there are some cookbooks in the collection that are geared towards cooking for 1 or 2 people. And then one of my favorite, America's Test Kitchen. This is awesome. They have a great cooking for 1 book as well. And you can see, I mean, just on that cover, we've got salmon, we have legumes, we have greens, some good recipes in here. Another one that I came across that I thought was great is called Eating in Color. And so incorporating all those colorful foods that Danny was talking about, this cookbook, this is one you may have to scale down some recipe sizes. When you're looking in cookbooks, it can be helpful to look for one that maybe does serving even for 4, and then that can be cut in half a little easier than something that makes enough for 8 or 10 people. I've bought mini muffin pans, and you can make, like, if you're a lasagna lover, a veggie lasagna lover, you can use mini muffin tins and make little mini ones. And I actually tend to freeze those. So maybe I make enough for 4. And so that's another way to think about using your freezer as ways to pre-plan, pre-cook, but then not have too many leftovers, so you're not eating lasagna for 8 days. Because I can't do that myself. Another favorite author, if you've never picked up a Mark Bittman cookbook, he has a couple of really great, well, all of his books are great. He has like the How to Cook Everything series. He has one that's How to Cook Everything Vegetarian. He has one called VB6, which is vegan before or vegetarian before 6. And where he encourages that your meals earlier in the day are plant-based, and then at dinner is like the one time a day that maybe you have animal protein. I also love this one. It's called Kitchen Matrix. And so say you have a favorite ingredient, let's pick something colorful, eggplant. And he has recipes on how to cook eggplant 12 different ways. So maybe you've got a vegetable garden and you grew eggplant and you have a few too many of them. He has a wide variety, and he does this with several different staple ingredients. Whether it's chicken, he has a steak one. Talks about, and what I loved about this book is he's got spice blends you can make yourself in the back. So talking about some of those fresh spices, he has suggestions on how to put your own together, give some variety to your cooking. I think spices are really one way to make our food more enjoyable. And I believe he even has a section on eggs, just really a whole number of different ingredients. There's a whole section on pears. So I really like his books. And then another one from him is Dinner for Everyone. And it's a way like to, it's easy vegan or perfect for company. So it's 100 iconic dishes that made 3 different ways. And so the idea here is maybe there's 2 of you in your household and one's a meat eater and one's not. I know personally, I ate vegan for quite a while, but I was still cooking for a family with 2 growing kids, and I would build meals around 2 or 3 things I could eat, and then would supplement with whatever else my family needed in addition to that. Another cookbook author and kind of well-known chef is Jamie Oliver. He does have a pretty high focus on healthy and nutritional recipes. So if you haven't picked up one from him, you can see all the colors in his example photos there. One of my favorite desserts to leave you with, something you can try if you've got a blender or a food processor, is making what's called an ice cream. And you could do that unsweetened cocoa, like Danny mentioned, chocolate, is pureeing a frozen banana and a little bit of cocoa in there. Makes a delicious kind of ice cream satisfied dessert. You can make sorbets really easy. I don't remember the name of the brand on it, but my kids gave me an individual ice cream maker for Christmas, where basically it is, I put in a couple of ingredients. I'll put in like non-fat yogurt and some frozen fruit, and then it runs for like 10 minutes and I have a scoop of ice cream or an ice cream, whatever I put in there. So there are ways to modify bigger recipes. There's ways to modify and use healthier ingredients in your food. And there is a huge cookbook collection from the library. It's a great place to start. I tend to check them out. And then if you saw my bookshelf at home, I probably have 50 cookbooks myself. So I usually check them out before I buy them. So I know that was a very quick push through that. Does anybody have any other questions or thoughts or any particular, any particular tips that they would like to share with the group? Oh, I think I see Sandra talking, but maybe you're muted. And I'm going to go ahead and hit stop on the recording, so that way, if anybody feels like chatting, they are not part of that. So I'm going to end that.